As I've said before, we have and we will continue to evaluate how we police toward achieving everyone's common goal of maintaining a community that has as little crime as possible. Preventing crime is more important than solving crime, because when crime has not occurred to begin with, that means that nobody was victimized. We've accomplished that, as crime is down in our service area about 43% over the last 5 years. And that means that many fewer people have been crime victims, fewer cars have been stolen, and fewer homes have been broken into. But regardless of crime being down, when we need to enforce the law, we must ensure that we are doing so in a manner that ensures the safety of citizens, law enforcement officers, and offenders. We need to have policies and procedures in place that mitigate the potential for harm to everyone involved. That means the cops, citizens, and those who commit crimes. Mitigating harm includes doing everything possible to avoid anyone getting hurt when we execute search warrants. There's been a lot of discussion recently about how law enforcement serves search warrants, and specifically what people will refer to as, quote, no-knock search warrants. From the commentary and discussions that I've had with citizens, I know that there's some confusion about what a, quote, no-knock search warrant is. I think it's important to clear that up and explain the tie between dynamic search warrant entries and these no-knock search warrants. We implemented practices here at the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office about 8 years ago that have helped to avoid many of the inherent dangers to officers and offenders that go along with serving search warrants, especially these dynamic entry search warrants. So today we are announcing that these practices are being made part of a formal Pinellas County Sheriff's Office general order and formal directives that deputies are now mandated to follow while serving search warrants. I'm going to give you a little bit of explanation about the background and then explain exactly what these new formal requirements are. So we know that the Fourth Amendment protects people from unreasonable search and seizure, including requiring probable cause before a search warrant is issued by a judge. The service of a search warrant must comply with constitutional requirements, statutory law, and court decisions. There is no requirement in the U.S. Constitution that law enforcement officers serving a search warrant, quote, knock and announce their presence before entering the location that they have the warrant to search. The knock and announce requirement is found in most states' statutes, and they require that law enforcement officers knock on the door and announce their presence prior to entering someone's home or other location. Here in Florida, Florida Statute 933.09 requires that law enforcement officers knock and announce, and the law states that an officer may break open any outer door, inner door, or window of a house, or any part of a house or anything therein to execute the warrant if, after due notice of the officer's authority and purpose, he or she is refused admittance to said house or access to anything therein. So the idea is that before cops go barging into someone's home, they should give the people inside an opportunity to know that the police are there, they have a search warrant, and give them the opportunity to let the police in. Officers are not required to follow this knock and announce requirement if they articulate what is called an exigent circumstance. So this exigent circumstance can exist because of officer safety concerns or because there is cause to believe that the evidence will be destroyed if the people inside know that the police are there with a warrant. The classic case is as the police are approaching the front door to serve a drug search warrant, they hear someone inside say, quote, "It's the cops, flush the stuff." The justification and decision not to knock and announce before entering generally occurs in a circumstance like that at the time that the officers are serving a warrant. So this means that the officers are at the location to be searched, and based on information or observations, they determine a situation is occurring that justifies or necessitates entering the location without prior notice of their presence to the location's occupants and giving those occupants an opportunity to open the door and provide access. In addition to articulating an exigent circumstance at the time the warrant is served, some states have laws that permit a judge to issue this so-called no-knock warrant ahead of the warrant being served. So remember that under Florida law, federal law, and most states' laws, that law enforcement can go to a judge and get a warrant, and they have up to 10 days to serve the warrant. So in some of these circumstances, under some states' laws and under federal law, you can go to a judge, say, Judge, we need to not do this whole knock and announce thing, and here's why, and here are the circumstances. But they may not be serving that warrant for up to 10 days later. So the point being, those circumstances can change. When a judge issues a no-knock warrant, that means the officer can disregard the requirement that they knock, announce their presence, and give people that opportunity inside to allow the officers in, because the cops have previously explained to the judge ahead of time why they believe that there is this circumstance justifying the no-knock. With the so-called no-knock warrant issued by a judge, there's no requirement that the officers articulate an exigent circumstance at the time they're serving the warrant, because the judge has already determined that they can dispense with the requirement. Now, this most often occurs in drug search warrants, where the officers explain to the judge why they believe that the evidence will be destroyed if they knock and announce and wait to be admitted before entering the location to be searched. So this is the type of warrant that was issued in the Breonna Taylor case. The cops went to the judge ahead of time, spelled out whatever they spelled out, and the judge predetermined that the officers did not have to knock and announce their presence and authority before entering the residence using a dynamic entry. So I've mentioned a few times about a dynamic entry, and I think we should spell out what that means. And that is an entry into a location, more times than not probably residences than other places, where the officers break in, sometimes using a ram or another tool, and there's a lot of noise and convergence associated with that type of entry. So that is breaking down the door, kicking in the door, removing a door from its frame. It's going in, using force to go in, and usually using some tools, and that's why it's referred to as a dynamic entry, because it's a blast into the location. Despite what happened in the Taylor case, here in Florida, the Florida Supreme Court has held there is no basis in the state of Florida for judges to issue these so-called no-knock warrants. So any concern that people have in the state of Florida in this call to not allow these judge-issued no-knock warrants, they can't happen here in the state of Florida. The Florida Supreme Court has said there is no basis for them. So that means that a judge cannot give cops permission ahead of time to not knock and announce before entering when they're serving a warrant. So in Florida, in order to dispense with that knock and announce requirement, there has to be the articulated exigent circumstance at the time the cops are serving the warrant, as I just explained to you. And it has to be, again, generally for officer safety reasons or because there's going to be imminent destruction of evidence. Whenever officers serve a no-knock warrant, whether it is judge-issued as permitted in some states and under federal law, but not here in Florida, or based on an exigent circumstance at the time the cops show up at the door, it will most certainly involve a dynamic entry, blasting in, breaking in, going in mass, and again, creating a lot of noise and distraction as they're going through the door. Compare a dynamic entry to what we call a soft entry. And a soft entry means knocking or ringing the doorbell and waiting for someone to answer and then explaining why the officers are there and entering the location. Some warrants are served by SWAT teams, maybe in the case of an armed robbery suspect, and some warrants are served through this soft approach, as I just described to you, by investigators, maybe in a child pornography investigation. The nature of the crime and the individual's propensity for violence are often the determining factors in how the warrant will be served, dynamic or a soft entry. There's inherent risk of harm to officers and the people inside the location to be searched when serving all search warrants, but especially in dynamic entry search warrants. Too many times when police have served these dynamic entry drug search warrants over the last several years, whether no knock or with first knocking and announcing their presence, someone has been injured or killed when the amount of drugs involved in that investigation is very minimal. These incidents have been widely reported by the media in Florida and across the country, and they're certainly available through open source reporting. One reason why dynamic entry warrants are so dangerous is that the people inside the location where the warrant is to be served are always caught by surprise and may not immediately comprehend that it's the police entering their home or business as opposed to an intruder, even when the police knock and announce their presence before entering. Because of the inherent danger in serving search warrants, especially drug warrants at people's homes, we informally changed the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office practices about 8 years ago, and today the changes are being put into written and formal policy. The Sheriff's Office practice, and now written and formal policy, states that the preservation of life and the mitigation of harm to members, occupants of the location where the warrant is to be served, and the public in general are paramount considerations when deciding how to serve a search warrant. Now, we have copies of the new written policy. We'll provide those to you here when I finish this afternoon. But the new policy requires that deputies mitigate the potential for harm by not serving dynamic entry search warrants unless authorized by a division commander or higher authority within the Sheriff's Office. Avoiding dynamic entry search warrants also avoids the exigent circumstance no-knock scenario because no urgent situation is created by barging in. Simply put, in my view, no amount of drugs is worth anyone's life, whether it's a law enforcement officer or a suspect. People deal drugs for a whole bunch of bad reasons, and they cause harm to others by their drug trafficking activities. We have and will aggressively pursue drug traffickers, and these traffickers need to be in jail. But we can accomplish that using safe techniques. Under the policy being announced today, deputies are required to mitigate the risk by conducting surveillance of the location for which the warrant has been issued to determine who lives at the location, how often people come and go, who resides at the location that is not related to the criminal activity, and whether elderly people, special needs people, or young children reside at the location. Unless there's a compelling reason to the contrary, deputies are prohibited from conducting the dynamic entry and are required to wait for the suspect to leave the location where they may be detained or arrested off-site. After the off-site arrest or detention, and with reasonable belief that the location to be searched is empty, deputies will then serve the search warrant. The goal is to serve search warrants on empty locations, as that is the safest for deputies and suspects. It is only when there's a violent crime, not just drug dealing, and all other avenues have been exhausted, that we authorize a dynamic entry search warrant. In sum, the danger to the deputies and the suspects must be weighed, and only when the necessity to serve the warrant in a dynamic manner is adequately demonstrated will such an entry be permitted. There are too many examples of situations where dynamic entry drug search warrants were served and people were injured or killed over small amounts of drugs, and that is the situation we hopefully avoid by this policy. Over the last 6 years, the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office Narcotics Division has served 81 search warrants and made hundreds of drug trafficking arrests. We're getting the job done and doing it the best we can to get the harmful drug dealers off the street while not doing these dynamic entry search warrants. Of the 81 warrants that we served, 75 have been soft entry or non-dynamic, and only 6 have been dynamic entry warrants. So that means only 7% of our search warrants have been dynamic entries, and those occurred after exhaustion of alternative methods. This is very different from the way it used to be when about 100% of our warrants were dynamic entry. Going back 10, 15 years ago or more, we had our own incidents where people were shot inside homes when we served these dynamic entry search warrants, and the risk of harm to deputies and suspects was significant. I'm not saying that what happened in the Taylor case, a dynamic entry shootout, can't happen here, but what I can say is that the chances of that are very minimal under our policy, and that every possible step is being taken to ensure that it does not occur when there are viable and safe alternatives available. So again, we'll pass out a copy of the policy. That's an overview. I know it was kind of long, but I think it's important to try and clarify that for you all and for the public, and to give you the backdrop, because I think the terminology of these no-knock warrants is being used inconsistently, and everybody's not real sure exactly what it is. They know they don't like it and they don't want it, but they're not differentiating between the judge-issued warrant and what happens at the time and what's happening in Florida and what's happening elsewhere. So I want to provide you that backdrop, but also the real purpose is to talk about not doing these dynamic entry search warrants and putting that in formal policy, because we want to make sure that what we do is worth it and that we value life more than anything else. So I'll take any questions that you all have.
Can you talk a little bit about the conversation that a commander or captain would have in making the decision to do a dynamic entry? What's that conversation?
So the first question is going to be from the commander that's assessing it is, what is the purpose of the warrant? If it's for drugs, what do we know about the people? Do we know the quantities of drugs that are involved? We know systemic drug trafficking. Are they armed? Do they have a propensity for violence? Everything that we possibly know about them and their activities historically. The next thing is going to be, we have probable cause, we have the warrant. Who lives at that house? Does the suspect live there by himself or herself? Are there kids there? Are there family members there? Are there special needs people there? People uninvolved in the criminal activity who live there? What do we know about the person's routine? What do we know about them coming and going? And trying to develop that alternative to doing the dynamic entry warrant. So we do pre-surveillance and we watch them. And one of the things you'll see in the policy that we are promulgating today is the amount of time that it takes to do these surveillances, the amount of time spent on surveillances, the amount of time committed to it is not a factor in determining whether we do an entry. I don't care how much time they spend. If they got to spend a day or 2 days figuring it out, I'd rather spend a day or 2 days figuring it out than sending a bunch of cops through that door with guns and having people on the other side that don't know who they are and they're coming, and we end up in a shootout. So we want to figure out how we can accomplish the goal, which is to seize the drugs, take the people who are these drug traffickers who are harming others into custody, but nobody gets hurt. So how often during the day does that person leave their house to go to the 7-Eleven, they go to Home Depot, they go to, wherever they're going? And when they're out of their house, they're out of the element, and it's all by surprise, you just walk up to them and take them into custody. That's a very safe way of doing it. Or perhaps on a traffic stop, they think that maybe they ran a red light. But nobody's barging through the door, and then after they are in custody, then we're going to find out from them, hopefully, and if they'll cooperate, great. If not, then we've done enough surveillance, we know that we have a reasonable degree of certainty that there is nobody in that house. Now, we're not 100% because there's no 100% in everything. So we're going to execute that warrant. We're going to go in a safe way. But there's a high degree of probability there's nobody in that house. If there are people in the house, but they're unrelated to the criminal activity, let's say it's a spouse or a grandmother or kids or whatever it is, then we're going to do a soft approach. We're just going to walk up to the door and say, here's who we are, here's what it is, and we're going to get them out safely. So that's the kind of conversation, the dialogue. It's all about circumstances and what do we know and how can we affect this. Now, the other side of that may be is that this is a warrant. The person inside has a history of violent crime. They've got a bunch of weapons. They never leave the house. Then we're going to have to evaluate it differently. But we're still going to make every effort to mitigate it. But that's the type of dialogue and exchange that occurs.
Chair, have you encouraged other Bay Area agencies to follow your lead? Because we've got a case similar to Breonna Taylor's in Tampa where a man had a small amount of marijuana and he was killed in one of these.
Yeah. I got to worry about the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. That, first and foremost is my only concern and my only responsibility. So, I started this years ago for a whole lot of reasons. I worked drug cases for 10 years. I've done dynamic entry search warrants. I've been the first person through the door many times. I know that they're dangerous, and I know there's a better way to do it. And what I saw us doing years ago, and again, this is going back 10 plus years, And what I saw happening, as reported by the media and other places, was certainly a moving force for me to say, we got to do this differently. So again, doing it differently is not something that we started in the last few weeks, months, or years. We've been doing it this way. What's different today, though, is that we are hopefully clearing up for everybody what it is that's being done and not done in Florida on no-knocks, and indelibly mandated in our policy that will be an absolute requirement that the deputies act in this way that we've been doing through practice. But as far as other agencies are concerned, you're going to have to talk to them, Josh, and see what they're doing or not doing.
So, Sheriff, to what extent did the Taylor case compel the change? You mentioned you kind of looked at it for a while, but was that really the final driving force?
No, because we've really been doing it this way, but I'll tell you what the Taylor case did, and from what I know about it, of course, I'm not there, so I don't have any inside knowledge. I've read a number of documents and some, not just media reports, but some of the underlying documents that have been published, is that what it did for me, without a doubt, is to absolutely reinforce for me that what we're doing is the right thing. What we're doing is the best practice. What we're doing is mitigating harm to the cops, to the citizens, and to the suspects. Because it comes down to, and this is just my belief, and others may feel differently, and they're welcome to have a different philosophy on it, is no amount of drugs, I don't care what it is or what's happening, no amount of drugs is worth anybody, whether it's a cop or a suspect, losing their life over. It's just not. You can do some bad things in this world, and you need to be held accountable for those things. And we're going to hold you accountable for those things. And if you're a drug trafficker, we're going to do everything we can to put you in jail. But to me, it's not worth somebody losing their life over. And our first and foremost job and responsibility is to preserve life. And if I've got to knock on a door, and I don't care whose door it is, if it's a family member of a cop or a family member of a suspect, and I got to tell them that their loved one was killed as a result of us executing a search warrant, and they ask why, it better be worth it. And to me, just going through the door because you can, not because you should, and because you didn't exhaust other reasonable alternatives that would be safer, doesn't cut it.
When would a dynamic entry search warrant be warranted? I know you were talking about, we have to look at this kind of as a last case scenario and look at all these other possibilities, but can you think of one example when it would be warranted that you should make that move?
Sure, and I can come up with, and these are just, I guess, just those. There are scenarios or hypotheticals, but they're also based on experience. And over the last several years, I've authorized them a couple of times. I remember one case where it was a homicide suspect. There was a bunch of people in the house. The person was armed, and they never left the house. Now, I say that time is not a factor. That's a general statement, but at some point, time does become a factor because you can't sit there for a month. And when the person's not leaving, and they probably know they're being looked for, and they're purposely holed up in there, then that creates a different situation and environment. But it's not an ordinary drug search warrant, a situation where somebody's wanted for a rape, a murder, a crime of violence. They have a propensity for violence. They're known to have weapons. You've tried some alternatives, maybe to try and use some ruses to get them out. Maybe you've tried to get people to cooperate to get them out. They're just not going to happen. And then you do your job and you do what you have to do. But those are going to be few and far between circumstances and situations, and we're going to have exhausted all the other means before we go to that. Because again, it has to be worth it. And so you do this balancing test about worth it. As I said in response to the question a second ago, to me, going in there for a little bit of cocaine or a little bit of marijuana or a little bit of meth or whatever it is, property and drugs aren't worth somebody's life as far as I'm concerned. But if you have somebody that killed somebody, somebody who raped somebody, somebody who committed a crime of violence, well, that puts it in a different situation, a different context. And sometimes we have to react differently to that. So I'm not saying we'll never do it, but I'm going to say that if we do it, it's going to be worth it, and it's going to be because it's been demonstrated to be necessary and really is our last resort. All right, anything else anybody have? Yeah.
The first time we've seen you since you came down with the coronavirus. Can you tell us how your symptoms were? Any idea how you caught it, anything?
Well, Josh, I don't know how I caught it, and I really don't have any idea on that, but I can tell you that as I've described it, and I'll describe it again here, it's a nasty illness. I still feel the effects of it. I still can't taste or smell. It's been a few weeks. The fatigue is still there, but I'm doing well. And I'm very fortunate in that I had what I'll consider to be minor, maybe a little bit towards moderate symptoms, but I really, really have a lot of sympathy, and I feel for those people who are having the moderate and certainly the severe symptoms. It's something that people really need to take seriously. It's not your average flu, I can tell you that. I had a lot of the symptoms, but I escaped the most serious symptoms, which were high fever and respiratory issues. But I still feel it, but my heart goes out to the people out there that are really suffering and those that have those moderate and severe symptoms. And all I say to everybody is respect that illness. It's not the average flu. You don't want it. All the precautions that are out there make sense, the masks and the distancing. And I can tell you that those things work, and how can I say that? Is because I can't figure out, other than we were doing it the right way, why people here didn't get it. Why did my family not get it? I don't know. But I can tell you here is that I came in contact with people. We were practicing all the social distancing. We were doing meetings where people were separated. We were keeping apart. I really think that staying 6 feet apart and not doing mass gatherings works. And if you have to get closer, wear a mask. And I really encourage people to do that. The numbers are down. Things look good. The percentage of positives are down. But they're down for a reason. They're down because of what we've been doing. So let's not undo it. And we've already been through that once. So I think we really need to, from somebody that's lived it, it's not fun.
We're glad to see you back, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. All right, thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Thanks.